Connecticut's economic dependence on slavery through the mid-1800s was not limited to its involvement in the West Indies trade or in buying cotton for its mills. More than 5,000 people were enslaved in early Connecticut. Archaeologist Gerry Sawyer is studying a large plantation worked by slaves in 18th century southeastern Connecticut.
My specialty in archaeology is in the African diaspora, in other words, the movement of African peoples from Africa across the Atlantic to wherever it is that they ended up. One of the things I tell my students all the time is the truth is in the ground. We're looking for the material remains, the garbage, the broken things, the lost things that people have used in the past, and trying then to understand the people behind those particular artifacts. What I'm doing right now as part of the Transatlantic Slave Trade Project is studying sort of a landscape of enslavement in southeastern Connecticut in particular. That's where I'm focusing right now. And the centerpiece of that particular project that I'm involved in is what was a very, very large plantation in Connecticut, possibly as large as 10,000 acres in size, which, if so, would put it at about 2.5 times the size of Monticello. We have a plantation that was in operation for maybe 100 years, starting in the very early 1700s, and employed varying numbers of captive Africans during that 100-year or so history of it. The name of the plantation was New Salem, and the area that it was in became Salem, Connecticut, okay, which is above New London. What we're finding is that the enslavement of Africans and Black Indians, if you will, African native peoples, and others was really not unusual in the North. In fact, in Connecticut, southeastern Massachusetts, Rhode Island, parts of New York, it was common. So there was a lot of enslavement going on, and not just on plantations. A plantation may be relatively unusual in Connecticut. There were several, what we would consider to be plantations. Plantations in our current interpretation of it, because originally large areas were, settled areas were called plantations. What became this particular plantation, New Salem, was started roughly around 1718. A gentleman by the name of Colonel Samuel Brown, who lived in Salem, Massachusetts, he was a wealthy merchant, politician, invested in land in this particular area around New London. He bought initially about a 4,000-acre purchase and then eventually added on to that, making up anywhere between 9,000 and 11,000 acres, depending on what documents you read. So he started roughly around 1718. By 1729, we have records of him bringing in a large number of enslaved Africans to help clear the land and starting to set it up as a big enterprise to make money, a farming enterprise to make money. He died early, his son took it over, his son died, his grandson took it over, and they ran it as this sort of agricultural enterprise until the time of the Revolution. At the time of the American Revolution, William Brown, then the grandson of the original founder, was a Tory and decided it probably would be in his better interest not to stay around in the colonies. So he left, went back to England. The lands were confiscated by the colony and then sold. Still, the land stayed agricultural for many, many years after that, and until shortly after the Revolution actually had enslaved Africans on it as well. We're dealing with such an incredibly complex site in southeastern Connecticut, not just a plantation, but surrounding enterprises that were going on. We have the large plantations with enslaved Africans. We have smaller farms with enslaved Africans. We have freed Africans living and conducting enterprises of their own, so forth and so on. We have burial grounds. We have house sites. We have farms. We have potential industrial sites, so forth and so on. All of these leave a different signature in the ground. One of the things that we've definitely explored is a small burial ground. I'd say initially the biggest surprise is the extent of this landscape. We started out with a cemetery and a few stone piles, and we thought that that may have been the extent of our investigations. In the 4 or 5 years that I've been doing this, we've covered literally several towns now, and we're finding all different kinds of relationships, all involving either enslaved peoples or recently freed peoples or whatever, marginalized peoples for sure. So the extent of this is just enormous. The other interesting thing, though, is that you have to consider that for the Africans being brought over here, they try to retain whatever aspects of culture they can that they had still in Africa or later in the Caribbean, if that's where they were coming from. And they're going to intermix with other peoples from other areas and with native populations. And they sort of develop an amalgam of cultural practices. Yet the material goods that they have to deal with, the clothes they wear, the items they use, for the most part are going to be European items. What we need to look for and what we have to develop is a way of seeing through African eyes, if you will, to begin to recognize how African peoples, enslaved African peoples, may have used those items in a way that's different than Europeans would have. So we look for a multivalency of objects, different uses of objects or different ways of using objects that would reflect an African presence.